I'm delighted today to welcome to the Common Sense podcast, Rafe Heydel-Mankoo. And you're somebody I've been following, obviously, in the culture war that's taken place in and around us. And I've seen you speak with such great elegance and composure in the face of some of life's interesting characters who want to debate you. But every single time I've seen you have a discussion, you've come out of it with flying colours, Rafe. So honestly, I can't thank you enough for coming on the show. It's great to have you.
Well, it's a great pleasure. I've long admired the stance that you've taken, and I think more power to you, and every encouragement for this great YouTube channel, because I know it's reaching a different audience than the ones that I normally speak to, which I think is really important in spreading the message beyond my own echo chamber. And I think it's destiny that we're speaking, because I had to smoke at my club a couple of days ago and I asked for a light, and the chap gave me this packet of matches, which I absolutely had never seen before. So I think it was destiny that we're supposed to meet today.
But isn't that peculiar? Because obviously when Twitter first started, I was one of the early footballers with a profile onto Twitter. And when I first started using it, my public perception was that bad that they were saying it can't be Joey Barton because he can't read and write. He can't, because I was obviously labelled a certain way by the media. And then I always remember somebody saying at the early part of that they shouldn't have allowed me on Twitter because it was the equivalent of giving an arsonist keys to a firework factory and a box of matches. So it's interesting that you pull out the box of matches.
You're certainly on fire, so
well, yeah. I mean...
And you've been flamed as well. I mean, I read some of the things that the Metro has a particular vendetta against you. I don't know. I mean, they're not really serious journalists there. I mean, they're absolutely, flagrantly trying to slander you on the way that they call you far right. I mean, you're the last person I would think of as being far right and so forth. And I think, for all the flack you're getting, you're doing a great job in stirring things up. And I think we need to do that because people, I think, are too scared to put their heads above the parapet. And so the more people that do that, the more encouragement you're going to give to other people. So hats off to you.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't by design. I just think we go through the world trying to be as honest as we can about what we're observing. That's where I think we strike a chord. I see you talking about lots of issues that I think lots of people need to know about. Certainly on these shores, I think it's become, in the last, certainly this century, turning, year 2000 was meant to be full of optimism. And for some bizarre reason, it's like almost shameful to be English, British, or proud of your heritage or proud of your culture. And it's almost like every single mistake that everyone's made is amplified, and yet all the positivity that's happened, it's kind of just a consequence. It's not really that important. I've seen you talking about obviously the history of these isles and the mass immigration that we're currently seeing.
Well, I mean, we're recording this a week or so after St. George's Day, and I think it's, supremely ironic and also telling of where we are, that every culture is now encouraged to celebrate their identity and their heritage, with one exception, and that's England and the English. Everybody else is supposed to celebrate wherever they're from, even within these isles. Obviously, when the Scots and the Welsh nationalists wave their flags, it's called progressive nationalism. When the English wave St. George's Cross, it's called racism. And I think it's beginning to stick in the craw of the English, because I've often said, Britain invented the modern world, but in large part it's England that invented the modern world. The global lingua franca is English, the mother of parliaments is British inspiration for around the world, the Industrial Revolution. England didn't invent capitalism, but no country did more to spread capitalism around the world, which, has basically been the driving force for the development of civilization. So there is so much that the English have to be proud of. And yet, I think England suffers Europe's greatest identity crisis. And one of the reasons for that is that everything that England invented has been offered up to be woven into the British national fabric in a way that you don't see in Scotland. So, for example, if you were to Google James Watt, you will see Scottish engineer and inventor. But then if you Google Isambard Kingdom Brunel, it will say British inventor.
Yeah.
So everything that England's done somehow has become British. And I think the English need to really reclaim for themselves those things that have become British, so that they can actually take pride in their achievements. And conversely, I think it's also very, very interesting that any perceived bad wrong Britain did is England's fault. And the great masterstroke of the Scottish nationalists is they've managed to be able to portray themselves as the victims of colonialism when they were actually, the Scots were the driving force behind the British Empire, along with the English. I mean, the Scots were the most adventurous people. The whole reason that they entered into the union with the UK, or one of the primary reasons that they entered into union with the UK in 1707, was because of the failure of their own imperial scheme, the Darien scheme, that almost bankrupted them. And so the Scots wanted to join with Britain. But the narrative you get today is simply about sort of William Wallace, Braveheart, freedom. They forget all the hundreds of years that followed that.
Was a good movie.
It was a great film. But the reality is, they've managed to cast themselves as being no different to, say, people in Sudan or Kenya. Like we're all victims of this English oppression, when actually the reverse is the case. And so you've got this creation of new myths in Britain now. So the Scots create this myth that they're an oppressed population. And in places like London, you've got Sadiq Khan creating this new myth that immigrants built London, which is a great slur on those generations of Londoners and English people who built St. Paul's Cathedral and the Houses of Parliament. And there was no immigrants were involved in those sorts of constructions.
The Irish might have been involved in the roads and stuff like that.
Oh yeah, well, the Irish were, but I mean, we're still talking about the British Isles.
Yeah.
We're talking about the British Isles here, and even now you get, this is the stage we're at, where you have this conservative in name only party, where Rishi Sunak, when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer, minted a 50p coin saying diversity built Britain. This is part of this new ridiculous myth that we have going. You're seeing it with BBC Horrible Histories, for example, where you're being taught now that black sub-Saharan Africans constructed Stonehenge. You've got The Guardian, where they say essentially that...
They hate me as well.
Well, what a surprise there. One of the few papers I've never been interviewed for. Then in The Guardian, of course, there are all these, actually, also they had a book published, beautiful black history, claiming that various Romans and others were sub-Saharan Africans. So there's a complete distortion of reality, because all civilizations depend upon myths. London was supposed to be founded by Gog and Magog, and by the King Lud and Troy. That was an inspiring myth, and now you're having new myths created to try to account for why Britain is a multicultural society. Britain hasn't always been multicultural. We can get into that a bit later, but that's what I'm really trying to do, is try to push back and not give necessarily an opinion on all of this stuff, but simply to present facts. Because I think when you're getting into the culture wars, it's so easy to take a side and get into these heated debates, and you blow hot air and you get passionate, and no one actually leaves any the wiser. And I think if you can just coolly and calmly present the facts of the case and let them speak for themselves, you can make the point more effectively. And so I try my best to do it that way.
Well, you're a historian and obviously a broadcaster. That's I see, in terms of, I think the good thing about social media is the ability for people to converse, sit down, have a conversation. I only done a small period as an academic. I went to uni for a year. I obviously went to school up until 16, left to become a footballer, or was leaving naturally. And then I went back to uni as a 30-year-old just because I was bored a little bit, and I did a philosophy degree and I loved it. But what it taught me was to take different perspectives, especially when you form an argument against something, whatever that philosophical topic was, and attack it from other positions that, to try and get its weakness. And what that does is it either strengthens your argument for what you believe, or it actually weakens it and you change your position. And I think these conversations, Rafe, are a massive opportunity for people to hear different, fact-based evidence that they are not hearing in the mainstream media, or they're not being taught in certain schools because of this kind of woke ideology that's infecting every fabric and every institution in our society. And it's in my opinion, I don't know about yours, but in my opinion, it's making us embarrassed to be patriotic and care about your country and care about your community. It's almost like it's shameful when, what have we got to do with slavery? We're the working class, half Irish, half English, from, working class Liverpool, who've managed to get out via the medium of sport of the kind of working class position. When have I ever benefited from slavery, white privilege? That wasn't That was the aristocracy.
Yeah,
That was the
well,
landed gentry. That wasn't the working class of the country, of the north.
yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, these are the, there's a sort of this theory going around now, this explanation that somehow everybody is culpable for the sins of their forefathers, and at the same time, you have to understand that in this country, there were only 3,000 slave owners out of a population of millions. The vast majority of the people of this country descend from people who lived lives of abject poverty akin to serfdom.
Yeah.
So why on earth should the descendants of people who lived such abjectly, sad lives be forced to pay reparations to people living in North America and the Caribbean who have no experience of slavery whatsoever? Because, of course, the whole purpose of reparations for slavery is to basically put the person who was disadvantaged back into the position they were there before. But that was 8 generations ago. So we're talking about the great-great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren of slaves. So in what way have they been affected by slavery? If anything, and this is one of the most controversial things I always say, which always sort of riles up the left, as you know, slavery was obviously horrific and an appalling injustice. And if I was around in the 19th century, I would absolutely be calling for reparations to slaves because they were alive and they are the victims of it. But the descendants of slaves today have far better lives than if their ancestors had never left Africa. So the life expectancy in the Caribbean, for example, is about 15 years longer than in Benin and West Africa, which is where most slaves came from. The GDP per head is something like 10 times higher in some Caribbean countries compared to what it is. So on every level, that you look at, the Caribbean nations are actually middle-income countries where the quality of life is far superior to what the situation is in West Africa. And I've never had anybody that I've debated with ever present me with any evidence to show how life is better in West Africa. And of course we know that it's not, because if it was, people would be emigrating there from the Caribbean, from Britain, from America. No one's denying the horrors of slavery. But the reality is today we are in a vastly different world and people are actually benefiting from the fact that they live abroad. I mean, when Muhammad Ali went to do the Rumble in the Jungle in Zaire against George Foreman, the media asked him, so what are your first impressions of Africa? He said, I'm so glad my granddaddy got on that boat. Now, that's Muhammad Ali, who's the absolute civil rights campaigner, passionate about African Americans.
I'm going to come back to that because I've got an interesting story for you. Go on, I don't want to stop you there.
And I would have more time for those people in BLM and the decolonizers and so forth. I'd have more time for their position if they were equally vocal about the far more important plight of slavery today, where 7 in every 1,000 Africans today is living in slavery. That's 10 million people. And that's not me saying that, that's the International Labour Organization.
They'll still wear certain major brands that they'll know will have Far East kind of child labour, which is in effect a version of slavery, isn't it? Do you know what I mean?
Pakistan is the global centre of slavery today. It's the headquarters of it all, again, for the garment industry and all this sort of stuff that you're referring to. And yet you have Sadiq Khan, who wants to have a museum of slavery in London and give funding for that. Yet when he went, he's always telling us that he's the son of a Pakistani bus driver. And yet when he went on an official visit to Pakistan, not once did he mention the issue of modern day slavery in that country. And I think the hypocrisy there just speaks for itself, because people are suffering today and you would rather focus on things that happened 200 years ago. And when you get all of these far left academics and radicals and others that you see going on about slavery, why aren't they protesting outside the High Commission of Nigeria or the embassies of Cameroon or Sudan? Well, I think Cameroon has 800,000 slaves there. And the fact that they don't take any position on all that sort of stuff makes you realize that this isn't about slavery. They don't care about slavery at all. This is about undermining Britain and the West. This is about destabilizing our society. It's part of a broad, we can get into it later, but it's part of the broader woke revolution, this sort of cultural Marxism that we're experiencing. And they are just trying to find any weak spot which they can attack a country on. So in the case of America and Britain, it's slavery. But they will find any weak point where they can make you feel guilty, because the whole goal here is essentially to demoralize and destabilize your society. This is what the communists did in Eastern Europe and in China and elsewhere. Firstly, you demonize your history, and then you rewrite that history as well to actually advance your own political agenda. And by doing that, the best way to conquer a people is to separate them from their past and their heritage, so they become rootless. Without your identity, you are very easy you become supplicant, and you're essentially much easier to take control of. And that's what we're seeing here in every sort of aspect of our cultural life today.
Yeah, I mean, if you make somebody embarrassed about the history, because there's a saying that, you'll go further for somebody else than what you will for yourself. So, for instance, me and you, and I say, Rafe, I'll meet you in the gym tomorrow. Yeah, I'll meet you in the gym. I wake up in the morning, I don't feel like going, but I don't want to let you down, so turn up.
I'll be quite happy if you don't.
But if I say to myself, I'm going to go to the gym in the night, and I get up and I go, I'm not going to go, I'll have I'll press snooze, and I'll let myself down, because I've made the commitment to you, I won't. So when you've got, and I seen this when I played for Rangers and that kind of Celtic Rangers thing, I went out to Northern Ireland whilst the Marchers were on to play in a game between Linfield and Glasgow Rangers, which is a kind of a version of Rangers or in Northern Ireland, which is a hotbed, in the 80s, it was a hotbed of kind of religious differences. And the doctor said to me when we landed off the plane, Joe, make sure you put your watch back. And I'm like, you come from Glasgow to just hopped up. I went, he went 300 years, because it's marching season. And what I found out there was people whose great grandfathers had died in these troubles and the differences, and these people were still carrying it to this day, and they couldn't leave it, not because they didn't want to leave it, but because it was letting the family down. And when I look at the conflicts going on around the world, Rafe, and the people who are obviously being refugees in the British Isles, and obviously illegal immigration into the British Isles, a lot of these people are coming from kind of war impacted areas. And when I look at it, I think we do have a duty of care to help people who are genuine refugees who are fleeing, bombs getting dropped on the house. But also, we've got to be careful that we don't break. We've got an NHS system that's at breaking point. We've got social services that are, if they haven't already absolutely imploded, they're on the verge of it. I've seen a story today where there's a lady who's about to get evicted from a house, and I think I tweeted back, well, she might as well go to France, come back on a dinghy, and she'll get 3 square meals a day and some nice accommodation. And I just think how in the last 25 years has our society got itself in this position? Do you genuinely believe there's some kind of world economic kind of George Soros type figure whose plan it is to destabilise our country?
Well, I think there definitely was a plan in terms of the Labour Party when they got elected to power in 97. So 25 years is a good gauge for this, right? 1997, we had the election of New Labour. And we know full well, because Andrew Neither, who was the speechwriter to the Minister of Immigration, actually wrote a piece in the Evening Standard a few years ago. And it was one of those rare moments when you actually get a glimpse behind the curtain of what really was going on back in 1997. And he said that the Labour Party's plan was, in essence, to flood the nation with immigrants, to create a truly multicultural society, in part to rub the right's nose in diversity. And they wanted to change the face of Britain, in part because 80% of ethnic minorities vote for the Labour Party. So if you flood the nation with people who are going to vote Labour, in a decade or two, you're going to have a nation which is going to, swing very much to the left. And if you look at London, if you look at the cities in the north, these have now become one-party states. So that's been a very effective plan. It was also, we can discuss a bit later.
Don't forget, we're sitting in Liverpool here today. It's always been a red wall up here, Liverpool, Manchester, the red wall of the north.
So Liverpool, I love coming to Liverpool because actually it reminds me, and I just say, look, this is not against immigration, this is against mass immigration we're talking about. I'm a child of immigrants, I'm a child of empire. And when I speak about this topic, when Suella Braverman speaks upon this topic, we're often deliberately misinterpreted by the media and people on the left who said, oh, well, how can you, of all people, be opposed to immigration?
No, but that's legal.
Yeah, well, no, it's not about legal, it's about numbers.
Yeah, but illegal immigration, we have to be against illegal immigration because
Well, we can have
it undermines everything else.
Well, we can discuss legal and illegal. So, right, I don't know which one you want to discuss first. So with legal immigration, in the 1980s, we had a very harmonious society. It was a monocultural society. People were free to celebrate at home their own cultures and diversity, but in the public square, it was Britain and British identity that was celebrated. And we had net immigration of around 50,000 per year. Last year, we had 1.2 million. We had more immigration last year than in the entire decades of the 80s and 90s. 20 years of immigration in 1 year. We've had more immigration in the last 20 years than in the last 2,000 years combined. So when I talk about mass immigration, I'm not talking about 1980s and 90s. If we had that, we wouldn't be here having this conversation because immigration wouldn't be an issue. And I think we had a very successful society then. And
I mean, there was National Front and there was elements, I remember bananas getting thrown at black players on the pitches.
Yeah, absolutely. But the point was, by the 80s and 90s, we had gotten over that. That was very much the 70s and from the 50s, 60s, 70s to the early 80s, you had, of course, a huge amount of resentment. But by the time you got to the 80s, when you saw Daley Thompson or Kenny Lynch or Tessa Sanderson or Fatima Whitbread, you didn't think about them as being black. You thought of them as being British. Today, people see everyone through their race. But back in those days, they were draped in the Union flag and they were absolutely accepted as being British. Because minority cultures weren't being elevated over British culture. What we've seen then has been on a completely different scale. We have never in the British history had the levels of immigration that we're currently seeing. And I think it's been the greatest act of national harm in our history. Far more consequential than Brexit and the European Union. Yet we were given a vote on Brexit, a referendum on Brexit. We were never given a referendum on immigration. And why not? On the contrary, every single government since 2010 have been voted in to lower immigration. So the British people have spoken, and rather than getting it under control, the Conservatives have put the pedal to the metal when it comes to immigration, far worse than under Labour.
Yeah, and I look at it and I go, okay, so what is the reasoning doing that? Firstly, I think with the Tory government, and this is just me, everything they do is money motivated, so it'll be profiteering in some way. What I hear is, and you might correct me if I'm wrong, that is it Sevco or something, the government contractor who run the jails, or they're actually in charge of security in Calais to stop people getting on boats and coming across. But actually, they're also in charge of housing people who actually do get across. So it's kind of like, there's got to be a conflict of interest there. If on one hand, one party or business is stopping people getting in dinghies or getting in boats and making their way across the channel, but on the other side of it, you profiteer from the people who make it across, well, surely you'd be pot inclined in terms of making more money to have your best people not at the border controller, because obviously then you're not getting your hotels filled. So when you see government contractors and people, you just follow the money, you can figure out why they're doing stuff. And then I look at it, do they now know we've ripped the country off, whether that was Boris and his cronies, whether that's, I wouldn't even, Liz Truss wasn't there long enough probably for the checks to clear. Sunak and all his links to, big investments in Moderna, and his wife's links into the Israeli Infos company via her old man. And then I look at it going, they now know they're fucked because of the way they handled the pandemic, and they know basically the coffers are empty because we've stolen it, pretty much, or our cronies via PPE or whatever, we've stolen it. And knowing that they're now handing over a mass immigration problem that's, as you say, record numbers in a year, 1.2 million, to the Labour Party, who are going to have to, because of the Labour principles, keep the NHS going, absolutely knowing they're handing them a ticking bomb that's going to explode, and that'll put them in good stead for the next cycle. Maybe it's 4 years, maybe it's 8 years, when the people get fed up. Morrissey famously writes about, as well as Irish Blood, English Heart, in that song, when the people are sick to death of Labour and Tory and spit upon the name Oliver Cromwell and denounce this royal line, that still salute him and will salute him forever. And the more I listen to that song, as I say, as you think, well, what's the point? You work hard, you pay your taxes, you're a good worker in this country for years, and you pay into your pension, and you're the person let down. And the people who are rewarded, Rafe, are these people who illegally are entering the country, and for political reasons they're being given housing and food, when our veterans and our pensioners are struggling to keep the heating on and have a decision to make and are dying because of the stress and the fear attached with that. And I just think it's just so wrong. And I go, why are they doing it? It can only be political. I don't think they care about people.
Well, I mean, look, in terms of illegal, well, firstly, in terms of illegal immigration, the Tory party just simply doesn't have a clue how to handle it. The Home Office is approving some 74% of applications, which I think is twice the number in France. I mean, the highest number of approvals for asylum seekers in Europe, I think is still, at least it was last year, is the UK. And because they've got this backlog now they're trying to get through, they're actually approving asylum applications at a much faster rate.
So is this to get cheap workforce? Is this to get cheap labour?
That's for mass immigration. So we must be careful to distinguish between illegal and legal. But yes, so of course, now instinctively you would think, why would the Tory party, knowing that 80% of ethnic minorities vote Labour, why would they want mass immigration? And it doesn't. And people always ask me this, and it's quite simple. It's because they don't have the interests of the British people at heart. They have the interests of their donors at heart, and that's big business. The CBI wants cheap labour. Why? Why are wages stagnant? Because of cheap labour coming in. Why haven't we advanced our economy? And why are we in? People talk about the lack of productivity in this country. It's because of mass immigration that's coming in. And big business over the last 20 years, rather than invest in capital infrastructure, so getting machines that can pick apples in the orchard and all that technology, they've relied on the easy, cheap option, which is to flood this nation with cheap workers. So you have the Labour Party doing it for its own ideological reasons, and then it gets even worse under the Tories, because actually for them, it's a failed economic system, but it's an economic model that big business wants, even though it's clearly damaging their own interest. Because, every year, 2% of Tory voters die. We've lost 10% of Tory voters in the last 10 years. Thousands of them die every day, and they're not being replenished because we have the most radically left-wing youth in history. 7% of youth 18 to 24 are going to vote for the Tories or centre-right party. That's 90% of the youth today vote for left-wing parties. And for the first time in history, they are not becoming more conservative as they get older. Why is that? Well, because they think capitalism has failed them.
They've got nothing to conserve. They can't afford to buy houses.
You normally get on the property ladder, and that makes you conservative, right? They can't get on the property ladder. They've got no pension. Their lifestyle is lower than their parents, the first time that's ever happened.
They're being actively discriminated against because of the colour of the skin.
And they've been discriminated against. One of the reasons they can't get on the property ladder is because of mass immigration, yet for some reason they haven't been able to draw that connection. Otherwise you think that there'd be more anti-immigration than they are. And so it's an entirely self-defeating policy of the Tory party. They're making themselves unelectable in the future, and they're not doing anything to address it. Now, in terms of illegal immigration, look, 80% of the illegal immigrants who come here are young men of fighting age. Contrast that to the Ukrainian refugees who came here, who are women, children, and the elderly. The majority of the illegal immigrants coming here are not fleeing from violence or abuse or homophobia or religious persecution. They are economic migrants. And because of the European Convention on Human Rights, because of the Human Rights Act, because of these these NGOs, they have tied up this government in knots. And what I also don't understand is why this allegedly conservative government hasn't simply gotten rid of this legislation. It's trying to do it now with this Rwanda scheme, but the Rwanda scheme has been going on for 4 years. They've been in power for 13 or 14 years now, and they've done nothing to try to make it easier to actually stop people coming. Now, all of this is because of something called the 1951 United Nations Convention on Refugees. And I've said for a long time that needs to be abolished and a new version needs to be put into place. Because in 1951, refugees meant people in Europe after the Second World War, the Jews and people from
Gypsies.
And my own family was Polish, couldn't go back to Poland. We came here in 1940 with the Polish government, couldn't go back to Poland because it was communist, and because of who my family were, they would have been imprisoned if they came back. So we stayed. that's a very different world to what we're talking about now. And so what I think there should be a new convention, and the new convention should quite clearly state refugees must be rehoused within their continent of origin. So if you're fleeing Sudan, you go to Kenya or to Algeria or Nigeria. Culture is the key thing that unites the peoples together. And the more ethnic diversity you have, the less cohesive society becomes. And all of the sociological evidence and the economic evidence shows that increased ethnic diversity, we have now super diversity in this country, weakens society. So
yeah, but this is the problem. Diversity, I think, is really, really good. Diversity. But that works on everybody buying into it. That's not having different types of people who then practice a religion that isolates them from the community and get, they all exist in the same community, but in essence, they don't acknowledge each other because they live completely separate cultural lifestyles. Diversity where everybody knows everybody and mixes, the way, that sounds crazy, but growing up working class, you knew everybody in the street, everybody knew everybody. I'm not saying everybody got on all the time, but people took time to care for the local people in the community. Everton and Liverpool will get to a cup final, Rafe, which only happened in, I think, 88. And they put all the tables and chairs in the middle of the street, blocked the road off. One side of the street was blue, one side red. And everybody came out and, they had tea in afternoon, whatever it was, before the game kicked off. But you knew everybody in your street. Now, these communities, certainly in the north, these mining towns, you've got, mass immigration and these are almost states within states.
Well, they're segregated communities, and there are large portions of Bradford and Burnley and Birmingham and elsewhere, which are essentially Blackburn, which are majority Muslim, Pakistani. Diversity, it's all about shades of diversity. And again, in the 80s and 90s, I think we were sufficiently a diverse society at that time. But what we have now is super diversity, and the scenes you talk about where you could leave your front door unlocked, you could leave your kids with the neighbor without any fear, that era has gone. And the community has gone, and it's because of diversity. So let me put it this way, imagine a scene of three elderly ladies of the same ethnicity or culture sitting at a bus stop. They're invariably going to have a conversation with each other. Now, if one of those people is a white English elderly lady, one is an African lady in African garb, and one is a Muslim woman in a Muslim garb, much less likely they're going to strike up a conversation.
Not impossible,
but far less likely. And it's that there's a utopian idea that the left have about diversity, that everyone's going to get along well. And none of the evidence shows that. And sociologists are the most left-wing academics of all. And all 87 studies that we have on diversity shows that it's actually a weakness. There was a major meta-analysis done of all 87 studies in 2019 by two Danish academics. And they showed that actually, far from being our greatest strength, as every week you hear a mayor or a police commissioner saying diversity is our greatest strength, it's actually our greatest dilemma. And when you combine diversity with multiculturalism and mass immigration, it becomes arguably our greatest weakness. And when I say multiculturalism, I don't mean multiracialism. This is another issue. Yeah. There's nothing, look, Kwasi Kwarteng, Suella Braverman, Rishi Sunak, myself, British first and foremost. So a multiracial society can be absolutely cohesive and effective and harmonious because there's one monoculture. But a multicultural society where everyone has their own competing beliefs, they don't integrate or assimilate, they keep their own traditions, ends up segregating society. So you'll just get people living side by side, living parallel lives. And it's completely changed the face of every mill town in the north of England to the heart of our capital city. Yeah. So a multiracial society is fine, but it's a multicultural society that we have to avoid. And unfortunately, we haven't avoided it because our police, our councils, our governments are all petrified by political correctness, which is why you see things like the rape gangs in the north of England going completely under the radar for 20 years because no one was willing enough to brave enough to tackle them.
Well, this is a cultural thing and maybe a culture of tolerance, and us as a society not having the right manager in charge. All right, so stick with me on it. In football, in a footballing context, the team is, if you got the best team, you win. In that team, there's lots of individuals. Now, all those individuals bring a unique skill set, but they all have to buy into the team's culture for the team to be successful. And what you're saying to me, in essence, is we've got all, in team sport, I read a book, Team of Teams, by General Stanley McChrystal, famous American, Afghan, Iraq, but we'll get onto that, general. And he talks about diversity within teams, especially the elite unit. It's important in terms of, because you get a lot of different perspectives. In society and culture, I think there is, we can't just have an all-white society or an all-Liverpool or an all-Manchester. That's unrealistic, because by the very fact that we're all individuals, we're diverse, we're all unique to our family units. So if you've got people who are coming in, as you rightly point out, and they're not willing to play for the team and buy into the team culture, then there's no way that can work. It can be harmonious. The team as a country isn't going to benefit, because we've got selfish interests that are directly working against the benefit of the whole group. So I'm with you. I believe different people coming and buying into it and buying into British culture and the values and principles is the most important thing that's been lost, because we've brought people in who actually are actively now trying to, destabilise the country, destabilise institutions, destabilise what it means to be patriotic and be proud of your culture and the good things it's done. And if we don't check it and we don't speak out about it, which we're doing, by having a conversation today, then there's going to be a tipping point where there's going to be a no coming back moment.
Yeah, I mean, why? Look, if you think about it this way, if you are and none of this is to attack, the majority of immigrants who come over here, right? Because they want a better life. Even these economic migrants who are coming here, if I was, living a life of poverty in North Africa, I'd want to go to a better life somewhere, right? So you can't. That's just human. That's just humanity. But
you can't expect to turn up there and just behave the way you was in Africa.
But everyone's going to try.
You've got to assimilate.
No, absolutely. But that's my point. But if you arrive here, and everything you see, the media tell you what an evil country Britain is. The politicians and others are always apologising for Britain's role in slavery. The academic institutions are talking about white supremacy and white privilege and systemic racism and the evils of the empire and so forth. Why would you want to buy into Britain when the only message you're getting is that this somehow is the centre of all evil, despite the fact, and this is another point which no one seems to know, or, Britain is the third least racist nation on the planet, behind only Brazil and Sweden. Every year there's something called the World Values Survey that's conducted by universities, not known for being right-wing. And these universities conduct this survey every year, and they ask people, how would you feel if somebody of a different race lived next door to you? And Britain consistently ranks amongst the top 5. It's currently number 3. The most racist places in the world, India number 1, Africa, Asia. These are the most racist places on the earth, and yet for some reason, then the least racist obviously are the Anglosphere and Scandinavia. Yet you never hear that. And that's my point. If you want people to assimilate here, you have to put forward a positive case for Britain. You have to celebrate Britain's achievements, celebrate ending the slave trade, celebrate what a tolerant nation this is, rather than constantly self-flagellating and navel-gazing and apologising for who we are. Because, you can understand why someone coming here from an Islamic culture would cleave naturally to the more masculine, well-defined culture of their forebears, because Muslims know who they are. They're proud of their identity, the Islamic ideology, which is a way of life, is just as potent and powerful as Western ideology. But the West, when the West was great, say in the 80s and in the 20th century, it knew what it was, and it was battling communism. And you had, Reagan and others, but whatever, Churchill, whatever, saying how great we were. People were positive and people integrated. Now it's the reverse. And so, of course, Islamic culture is going to seem more appealing when it's not constantly...
Well, communism, fascism was the big, enemy. Now it's obviously Islam and all the fear that they've got attached to, people coming here with a different culture. And when I look across it and we think back to, certainly just my modern history in school, I'm not a historian, mate, like you, but... the Romans came here because we've got all the big cities, Manchester, everything, Worcester, etc., the roads, Hadrian's Wall when it was up at Newcastle. And I seen you say that, I think the island's population of foreigners at that point was 3% when the Romans were here. Then we had, obviously, you've had the Vikings, you've had the Normans come here. So firstly, if there is any repatriations due back to anybody, if the British got a reasonable claim to the Vatican and the Romans, or maybe even to the Scandinavian countries and the Vikings for years of pillaging the land and the resources?
Oh, yeah. Well, if you want to talk about reparations and all of that, yeah, absolutely. What did the Romans ever do for us?
Yeah.
I mean, you can draw clear parallels between the Roman Empire and the British Empire, right? No one says, oh, those damn Romans coming over, building those straight roads, founding our cities. Today we look back at that, and the British have always said how thankful they are, right? British Empire had lots of negatives, right? No one's denying or dismissing some of the horrendous atrocities committed particularly in the first half of the British Empire. But my God, the second half of the British Empire was primarily spent trying to atone for the sins of the first half. Leading the world in the abolition of slavery, but also but when you talk about colonialism, who built the hospitals? Who established the universities? Who actually created the infrastructure, the railways? In India, they stopped sutti, which is the burning of Hindu widows on the funeral pyre of their husbands, stopping the infanticide of young girls, passing a law against that, allowing Hindu women to remarry. I mean, women's rights around the world were improved because of the British Empire going to these places. Churchill gets lots of flack for things he said about India. He was primarily talking about Hindus because he objected a lot to their caste system. Now he said very bad things about them, but he just hated the way that they existed in their caste system.
Their caste system's very, very similar to our kind of working class, middle class, aristocracy or upper class. Their class system is still massively in place, because I know somebody who went to work out there in India in the football side, and he said it's just rampant. He said the way they speak to the next person down is just outrageous.
It's absolutely
and
boring.
They're all the same colour skin.
And so the British Empire did a huge amount of positivity. There would be far fewer democracies in the world were it not for the British Empire, because we left behind, for example, in India, the civil service, but we established legislatures and principles of parliament around the world to a degree you didn't see the Spanish do or the Portuguese do with their empires, for example. So actually the world is a far more just and democratic place because of what the British Empire did, and the living standards of the world have improved because of the British Empire in large part. I would say capitalism and colonialism, nothing did more to lift the world out of poverty than those two things, despite the evils of colonialism. And this is not to say that imperialism is great, but my problem with the world today is that we only ever hear the negative. And you have to have balance in this world, because nothing is black and white. There are always grey areas, and there are always a good and a bad side. And our children aren't being taught any of the stuff that I've just told you, the positive side. They're not being taught about Britain being the first empire in history to abolish the slave trade. It expended, a sum equivalent to the entire current defence budget on the West Africa Squadron, which went around the seas to enforce an abolition to the slave trade. Went into, there were more Africans held in bondage by other Africans than were ever transported across the Atlantic.
I was going to say that to you. I was going to say, when we were talking about the slave trade before, there was a famous, I think he's the most celebrated king in Africa. He's the richest man ever, Musa or something like that. I can't remember his name. And by all accounts, they were capturing rival tribes and then selling them and getting them shipped across. And then obviously once they got to the Caribbean, they were obviously traded there.
European ships, the Europeans didn't go inland. They moored their ships off the coast of West Africa, and there were slave markets built along the coast. So they would just go to these markets, and it was Africans enslaving other Africans. They actually did the enslaving, if you want to put it that way. And when Britain, and as I said, but they also kept their own slaves and were far more brutal in some cases than we'd find in North America or the Caribbean, for example. I mean, in Benin and in the Kingdom of Dahomey, they would have annual sacrifices of hundreds, if not thousands, of slaves every year, and brutal sacrifices would take place. And when Britain abolished the slave trade and slavery, there was a huge amount of resistance within Africa where they wanted to carry on and continuing it. And indeed, it did carry on into the 20th century in terms of the Islamic slave trade, which you also never hear about, which started hundreds of years before Europeans arrived, carried on into the 20th century. You could say it still carries on today. Now, why aren't there huge African populations in the Middle East? Because they were castrated so that they couldn't procreate, which is why you don't see that population there.
Yeah, because you had all the Sudanese and obviously the East Africans for the for the Egyptian, obviously, civilization, a lot of the migration on that side. And then also when you think to the modern era, we've just had the World Cup in Qatar, that there's rumours one of them will be in Saudi. Big human rights issues there in around the infrastructure and the stadiums being built. Obviously all the virtue signalers in this country were all doing the right and saying the right things, and then all of a sudden, they got offered the money to go and work and all of a sudden, all the human rights and the
exactly,
they
don't need to say who
disappeared.
There,
yeah, we were. We could insert multiple names. There's a lot of those people out there, and that's the thing about it. It's you read about the Barbary pirates or whatever raiding the kind of south coast of England, and slavery isn't something that was invented, in the 1700s or 1600s. It's something that has clearly been a massive part of human history for as long as we've been, around. Everybody has taken advantage of their tribe's power and position to capture people, because people obviously give you, a workforce that at that point would, if you don't want to do the work, then it's easier to get someone else to do that. Or if you don't want to fight, it's easier to get someone else to do that. So I think we're in strange times, Rafe, in terms of, when I look at it, the ridiculous amount from, 3, 4, 5% of the population to kind of 15, 16%, I think you said in 2021. Whereas I don't even know what it'll be next time we look, if we've had...
Yeah, so this is it. I mean, this is what, again, the myth that we get is that diversity built Britain, that Britain has always been a nation of immigrants. This is what we always hear now. This is it's always been a nation of immigrants. No, it hasn't. As I said, under the Romans, it was 3%. Under the Vikings, it was 5%. But then for the next 1,000 years, it was less than 1%. So in 1851, it was, I think, 0.5% was born abroad. Then it took about 50 years. 1901, I think it was, it got to 1.5%. Then it took another, basically every 50...
Yeah, 1951, 4%.
Yeah, so it took about 50 years to go up by 4%. Now that's happening every 10 years. It's going up by 4%.
So that's 100 years. That's gone up. That's gone up 3.5%.
16.6%. Yeah. And 42% of the 10 million foreign-born immigrants came here in the last 10 years. And to put that into context for you, in 2010... Professor David Coleman, who is Professor Emeritus at Oxford University and is one of the world's leading demographers, he said that at 2010 levels of immigration, white British will become an ethnic minority in the UK by 2066. Now, those 2010 levels of immigration are half of what we're currently having. So that means, by my calculation, by some point in the 2050s, white British will become an ethnic minority. So how can people say, well, what does that mean? You're being racist by saying that. Well, no, the point is, at what point does Britain stop being Britain? If there's only 30% white British, is it still Britain? And how can you expect immigrants to assimilate and integrate into a culture when the indigenous population is itself an ethnic minority?
And being discriminated against.
Yeah. And what's the common culture going to be, Only fools and horses, all the sports stuff, the music... That's all based upon a white British culture. But if that's now a minority, what are going to be the common things that unite us? Because we're going to be, as I like to say, we are a united kingdom, not a United Nations. And unfortunately, we're becoming a United Nations. And if you import the world as well, you're importing their problems. And so we see strife between, say, Hindus and Muslims. We saw in Leicester recently and so forth. Because there's no overarching British culture.
We've seen all the stabbing in London. That's got to be due with cultural...
Not just stabbing, right? We've got people now with machete attacks, right? Where did this come? This is obviously an import from abroad.
Swords fighting.
Gangs, and doing it blatantly open in broad daylight. This is the dark side of diversity that no one is able to talk about. Because basically when you get segregated communities, they're more than twice as likely to become extremists, for example, but they also act like petri dishes for the cultivation of practices that we here find abhorrent. Female genital mutilation, you have honour killings, you have acid attacks. Britain is now the leading country for acid attacks, all right? Now, we had a brief spate of it in the Victorian era, but this is all because of South Asian and Central Asian things coming over. We had in Clapham in London, we had an acid attack recently as part of that. You know, the whole phenomenon of rape gangs in Rotherham and Oldham. Well, people call it grooming gangs to be polite, but actually...
Rape gangs, yeah.
Rape gangs is, I think, how we should call it. You know,
Paedophile gangs, yeah.
Call it what it is. And the Metropolitan Police in London now have a unit to train officers in identifying witchcraft because of the practice of abusing, the ritual abuse of children due to witchcraft practices. Now, you know, when I was studying history in secondary school, I loved the Tudors because it was all about beheadings and witchcraft and all this sort of stuff. And that was 500 years ago. Now in 21st century Britain, when you think about Ree Ligby being beheaded on the streets of London, witchcraft on the streets of London, we're actually going backwards. And I am actually in many ways an old-fashioned liberal. And I liked the liberal society that we had, where you had, you know, gay people could go around without being beaten up, women's rights. Homophobia, misogyny, anti-Semitism are all on the rise in London and Birmingham and these places at the same time that the white British population is declining. And yet, you know, the BBC and others always talk about this, but they never say why misogyny and anti-Semitism and homophobia are on the rise. And it's only in the last year or so, because of the Palestinian marches, that people are beginning to finally connect the dots because they're seeing the rise in anti-Semitism. But it's this, you know, young gay people used to always flee to places like London for a secure, safe lifestyle. Now, of course, it's the opposite's the case.
Yeah. And we'll get back to that marches because it ties in nicely to my next point we're going on. But just when you were talking there, I always remember listening to Enoch Powell, and obviously when you said you have to be careful saying it, that's why, because, you know, I'm not saying I agree with Enoch, but when you listen to that kind of Rivers of Blood speech, the stuff that they were talking about is actually what we're seeing now. Now, I don't believe he was like Nostradamus and he was able to predict the future, but clearly they were seeing warning signs about becoming too diverse too soon. You know, obviously in those days that will have been out the back of the Second World War and that kind of Windrush generation into the kind of late 60s, early 70s, the 80s. I grow up, we've got problems here, Toxteth riots, then Hillsborough at the end of that decade. So the people of Liverpool have always kind of been a little bit anti-establishment, anti-kind of Tory government. We spoke before about Churchill, and there's rumours, or that's what the people say around here, that there was a gunboat that Churchill ordered to be in the Mersey to try to break up, I think, a dockers' strike. So Liverpool's always kind of had a big immigrant population, you know, lots of Irish background, but also big Chinatown, and obviously the south end of the city in Toxteth, you've got, you know, a lot of different minorities there. But then I think the problem we've got certainly rolled out across the country now is, you know, I was talking to a guy yesterday who's been out to Ireland to see what was going on in their immigration. He said there was a town, Rosslare or something like that, that had, let's say, 1,200 people in the local population, and 1,000 immigrants have been put into the town. So it's, you know, it's double. So that puts an absolute strain on everything, if not overloaded to the point of breaking it down. And that's why when I look at it, I go, for me, two big things happened in a short space of time. You had COVID and the lockdown and everything that went on with that, furlough, which was a unique time in history. And then George Floyd got killed in America, and the outrage, and then the Black Lives Matter and the kind of, you know, rebellion out there that then kind of the tsunami of which washed over here. And this is what I want to get into with you, Rafe. I then took a job at Bristol Rovers, and moved to Bristol during the pandemic. You know, the world was locked down, football was locked down for COVID. And whilst I was there, or just before I got there, the Colston statue had been pulled down and dragged into the harbour. You know, I just seen that on the news. And then 3 weeks after that happened, I then got a job in Bristol. And I'd seen where they'd rioted and smashed the police station up, pulled the statue down. And then when I started to look around the city, it was like Colston Girls for Schools, Colston University Library, Colston Hospital. And I'm like, nobody smashed all them up.
Yeah,
like
funny that, isn't it?
You know, and what I learned about this guy was he was, you know, in the tobacco and slave trade, I think, but was an incredible citizen and, you know, used his wealth and the money he made to you know, philanthropic endeavours across the city and education for people who weren't as wealthy as him. And all of that's conveniently not mentioned. It's like, let's focus on the stuff that we can get militant about. How much do you think that George Floyd, Black Lives Matter, because it's a US issue that who've got a completely different demographic to us, you know, certainly when it comes to black, white and slavery, completely different relationship with it than us in the UK. How much of that impact do you still feel is in our society now? Or do you feel, you know, the woke have had their peak point and we're starting to come back from it?
No, this is just we're in the foothills of the woke revolution. And it is a woke revolution where I often say Britain is now a post-revolutionary society. You know, the establishment is not what you think about, you know, people smoking cigars in gentlemen's clubs. They're long gone and buried. The establishment is the progressive left. All of our institutions look the same, but the civilization that built them, the people that built them, bear no comparison to the people who now occupies them. The people that occupy all of our institutions are cuckoos in the nest. This goes through the civil service, the Home Office, it goes through all of our cultural institutions, it goes through all of the media institutions, the legacy media. We have already had this revolution, and we are now the counter-revolutionaries. That's why we're having to have these podcasts rather than having discussions on BBC Two. It's almost, we are a new... the majority of the British population is an underground movement.
I can't see, maybe your head will be all right, but I can't see my head on a Che Guevara type t-shirt selling that well, Rafe. I just can't.
Well, I've got the beard for it at
you
least.
might get away with it, yeah.
But
Mike Tyson getting a tattoo on his arm of you.
But the George Floyd thing was remarkable, right? This was a man who died in Minnesota with a violent criminal who put a gun to the belly of a pregnant woman. And there are now at least 2 statues of this person. So if you're going to topple...
Didn't he die of a fentanyl overdose when the autopsy come back?
Yeah, well, I mean, you can always debate what actually
it looked terrible,
to
the
the
video,
whole thing.
didn't it? It did look terrible.
But this was a nasty individual who was a violent criminal and drug addict who has now become sanctified by BLM, and they're talking about knocking down the statue of Edward Colston and, you know, even Mahatma Gandhi for being, you know, anti-black. And they're erecting a statue to this violent, you know, thug. That tells you that this is not really about any of this. This is about a wider movement, a wider anti-West movement. It's American Marxism, which we have become victims to, because the woke movement is essentially an Anglosphere phenomenon. You don't see this, for example, in Italy or in Spain or Greece or these countries, where you see it as Canada, America, Australia, Britain, and Scandinavia and Holland, where, of course, they're almost fluently bilingual. So this has been transmitted.
We've infected them.
Yeah, it's a woke mind virus transmitted through sound, and it all comes from America
and culture. Because all your pop stars, all your sports stars, they've all been down this path.
So, yeah, I mean, and now, of course, you asked, is there still evidence of George Floyd? You know, if we could have a drinking game here with a shot glass and watch the commercials for 2 hours on ITV, and every time a white man shows up, have a drink, we'll still be sober after an hour. You know, there's no surprise that British youth, for example, believe that the black population of this country is several times what it actually is, because there's been this calculated effort now to overrepresent ethnic minorities in the media. And again, I'm all for me.
2.5 times more.
Yeah, well, it's more than that, actually. Far more than that. But, you know, the only times now you ever see a white man in a commercial is if he is a villain, or if he is completely useless and has to be helped out by somebody else. So this is a war on, you know, this is what the woke revolution is all about. It's attacking white people, attacking males, attacking heterosexuality. These are all part of this sort of wider cultural Marxist revolution.
Yeah, I mean, no woe me here, but you can feel that the white male of a certain age, you know, and I would say all ages actually, but certainly of a certain age, kind of north of 40, they're being openly discriminated against them. I mean, because we've gone down this, we need to, whether it's an ESG, getting grants and, people talk about kind of BlackRock and Vanguard or whatever sitting above that, or whether this is a reaction to George Floyd, Black Lives Matter. Oh, fuck, we need to be embarrassed about everything that's happened in our culture, right? In Sky, I don't want to name, in Sky or BT. We're all white and we're in chief exec and producer jobs and we're all on six-figure salaries. We don't want to lose these. Let's diversify in front of the camera as much as we possibly can.
Yeah, so every single company advertising wants to be seen to be doing their bit. So you'll have 5 adverts in a break, and each company wants to do the thing, and so you get this over. That's exactly what's happened. And this isn't anecdotal. We have the data to show this. Think tanks have done the studies, and white men are almost never shown now, or if they are shown, it's in a very negative light. For example, there were 2 videos recorded, one by the police somewhere in the north of England, and another one in London by the London Assembly, by the Mayor's office, about sexual harassment and date rape, drugs, or whatever. And grooming. It was the grooming gang thing, and it was date rape and sexual harassment. And in both cases, they originally had an Asian person doing the grooming gang video. That had to be refilmed with a white man. And then with the sexual harassment in London, it was a white guy doing it, and it was a black man saying to him, "Hey, ease off, mate, don't be like that." Now you can make your own assumptions as to whether the statistics back up those depictions, particularly in London, where it's only 37.5% white British. So there's a clear agenda here that's being portrayed, and unfortunately, people aren't brave enough to actually address the elephant in the room. People can see what's going on, but no one actually is willing to call it out.